every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air in a small English town has a particular quality, especially one nestled in the post-industrial heartland of Greater Manchester. It's a tapestry woven from the scent of damp earth, the lingering ghost of coal smoke from mills long silent, and the quiet hum of generations living and dying in the same red-brick terraced houses. In towns like Hyde, life follows a rhythm, a predictable cadence of market days, Sunday roasts, and the familiar face of the local general practitioner. The GP, the family doctor, is more than a medical professional. He is a civic institution. He is a confidant, a pillar of the community, the keeper of secrets shared in the sterile quiet of the consulting room, and the gentle shepherd of his flock, from the cradle to the very edge of the grave. He is the one you call in the flickering blue light of a television screen in the dead of night when a child's fever spikes into frightening territory. He is the one who sits by the bedside of an elderly parent, a calm presence in a room thick with anticipatory grief, offering not just medicine, but the profound comfort. His leather bag is a symbol, a vessel of reassurance containing stethoscopes and salves, prescriptions and promises of relief. It is an icon of a sacred, almost primal, trust. But what happens when that trust is not just broken, but pathologically inverted? What happens when the comforting knock on the door is not a prelude to healing, but a prelude to termination? What happens when the gentle hand offering a syringe is not delivering a pain-relieving balm, but a meticulously measured dose of death? For more than 2 decades, in the unassuming workaday town of Hyde, that is precisely what happened. The most trusted man in the community was also its most prolific and silent predator. A man who transformed the sacred act of the house call, that ultimate symbol of medical dedication, into a cold, calculated, and repeated hunt. His name was Dr. Harold Frederick Shipman. To his thousands of patients, he was Fred, or simply Dr. Shipman, a bit serious, perhaps, a touch arrogant, some might concede, but he was seen as thorough, dependable, a good old-fashioned doctor who wasn't afraid to visit his elderly patients at home, who would sit and have a cup of tea, who understood their ailments, and, more importantly, their loneliness. He was, by all outward appearances, the very model of a dedicated physician. But behind this meticulously crafted mask of professional care, Shipman was operating with a chilling duplicity that defies comprehension. He was methodically, systematically, murdering the very people who had placed their lives, their fears, and their faith in his hands. His weapon was not a knife or a gun, but the most potent tool in his medical arsenal, the one that symbolized his healing power. The hypodermic needle. His poison was not some exotic substance procured from the dark corners of the world, but the one he knew best, the one most associated with final, peaceful relief from suffering: diamorphine, medical-grade heroin. He killed in plain sight, in the middle of the day, in his patients' own sunlit living rooms and quiet bedrooms. He then sat down at his desk and, with the same calm, dispassionate precision, falsified their medical records, composing clinical narratives that transformed murder into natural death, heart failure, old age, bronchopneumonia, cerebrovascular accident. He wielded the clinical lexicon like a shield, using the very language of medicine to obscure the ghastly reality of his crimes. He preyed on the vulnerable, the elderly, the isolated, knowing that the death of an 80-year-old woman in her own armchair would rarely, if ever, raise an eyebrow. It was the perfect, tragic camouflage, and for over 20 years it worked. Today on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the case of Dr. Harold Shipman, a man who remains, by official count, the most prolific serial killer in modern history. This is not simply a story of a monster hiding in plain sight. It is a story about the systems that allowed him to flourish, the institutions that failed to see him, and the culture that refused to believe him possible. We will explore the anatomy of betrayed trust. We will examine how a man sworn by the Hippocratic oath to preserve life became a master of ending it, and how the very institutions designed to protect us, the medical profession, the coronial system, and the simple, profound faith we place in our doctors, became his unwitting accomplices. We will trace the path from a strange, formative childhood dominated by his mother's death, to the fatal mistake born of pure greed that finally brought his decades-long reign of terror to an end. This is the story of how a doctor's bag became a coffin, and how the silence of a stethoscope concealed the quiet, steady beat of hundreds upon hundreds of stopped hearts. The roots of Harold Shipman's dark compulsion may lie, as they so often do, in the complex soil of his childhood. Born in Nottingham in 1946 to a working-class family, Harold, or Fred as he was known, was the middle child, but he occupied the center of his mother Vera's world. Vera was a powerful, domineering woman, and she poured all her ambitions into her favorite son. She instilled in him a powerful sense of his own specialness, a belief in his intellectual superiority that would calcify into a profound and dangerous arrogance in his adult life. His father, also named Harold, was a lorry driver, a distant, passive figure in the household, eclipsed by the force of his wife's personality. Young Fred was clever, an accomplished rugby player, and a talented long-distance runner, but he was socially awkward, an outsider. He was an observer, watching the world with a detached intensity, a trait that would later serve him well in his clinical assessments, both medical and murderous. The defining event of his adolescence, the moment that seems to have acted as the psychological blueprint for his future crimes, came when he was 17. Vera was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. In an era before hospice care was common, she was cared for at home, and her decline was protracted and agonizing. Young Harold became her devoted primary caregiver. He was a daily witness to the brutal realities of the disease, the relentless pain, the wasting of the body, the loss of dignity, and he watched with an almost scientific fascination the role of the family doctor who would visit the home. He saw how the doctor's visits brought a measure of peace to the chaotic household. The doctor would administer morphine, and his mother's suffering would ebb away. She would become calm, tranquil, slipping into a peaceful, opiate-induced state. For an intense, intelligent teenage boy watching the person he loved most in the world die, this act must have seemed almost godlike. The power to dispense relief, to control pain, to manage the very process of dying. It was a powerful and formative lesson. Vera Shipman died on June 21, 1963. Harold was holding her hand. The image of his mother, passive and peaceful under the influence of a doctor-administered opiate, was seared into his psyche. Psychologists have theorized that in this moment, Shipman developed a profound, distorted association between opiates and the quiet, controlled death of an older woman. A macabre tableau he would go on to morbidly reenact, again and again, for the next 3 decades, casting himself in the role of the doctor with the ultimate power. Driven by this experience, or perhaps simply fulfilling his mother's ambition for him, Shipman set his sights on a career in medicine. He scraped together the grades to get into Leeds School of Medicine, and it was there he met his future wife, Primrose Oxtoby. Their courtship was a whirlwind. She became pregnant at 17, and they married when he was just 19, a move that further isolated him from his student peers. Primrose became his anchor, a steady and supportive presence who would, by all accounts, remain oblivious to her husband's secret life for decades. But even in these early years, there were signs of the arrogance and controlling nature that would later define him. He was seen as aloof, a man who believed he was intellectually superior to everyone around him, a belief his mother had so carefully nurtured. After graduating in 1970, he began his career, eventually taking a position as a general practitioner in the small town of Todmorden, West Yorkshire. It was here, in 1975, that the first major crack in his professional facade appeared, a glaring red flag that should have ended his career. He was caught forging prescriptions for pethidine, a synthetic opioid similar to morphine, for his own personal use. He had developed a serious addiction and was suffering from blackouts. The senior partner at the practice, Dr. Michael Grieve, discovered the deception. He found that Shipman had been writing prescriptions for vast quantities of the drug in patients' names, then keeping the medication for himself. When confronted, Shipman at first denied it, then broke down. He was forced to leave the practice in disgrace. He was charged and subsequently convicted of 8 counts of forgery and drug offenses. He was fined £600 and sent to a psychiatric rehabilitation clinic in York. This should have been the end of the line. A doctor, a trusted GP, with access to vulnerable patients and controlled substances, addicted to opiates, and convicted of forgery and deception. By any reasonable standard, he should have been struck off the medical register, his license to practice medicine revoked permanently. But he wasn't. This was the first catastrophic systemic failure in a long chain of them. The General Medical Council, the body responsible for regulating doctors in the UK, reviewed his case. Shipman, articulate and plausible, presented himself as a man who had buckled under the pressure of work, a man suffering from depression. He convinced them he was rehabilitated, that his addiction was a temporary lapse. The GMC of the 1970s was an old boys' club, an institution deeply reluctant to end the career of one of its own. They saw a bright young doctor who had made a mistake, not a dangerously deceptive addict. After a period of psychiatric treatment, he was deemed fit to practice medicine again, with only a warning placed on his record. In 1977, just 2 years after a criminal conviction that revealed a deep-seated affinity for deception and opiates, Dr. Harold Shipman was given the keys to the kingdom. He secured a position at the Donnybrook Medical Centre in the town of Hyde, Greater Manchester. And it was here, in this quiet, unsuspecting community, that his secret work, his true life's project, truly began. Hyde in the late 1970s and 80s was a town like countless others in the north of England, a post-industrial community built on the wealth of cotton and coal, now adjusting to a new, quieter reality. It was a place where people knew their neighbors, where community ties were strong, and where the family doctor was an unimpeachable figure of authority. When Dr. Shipman joined the Donnybrook practice, he quickly established himself as a hard-working, diligent physician. He was popular with patients, particularly the elderly. He had a somewhat formal, even brusque manner, but patients interpreted this as a sign of his seriousness and intelligence. He was not a doctor who wasted time with pleasantries. He got straight to the point, and most importantly, he made house calls. In an era when the traditional house call was becoming increasingly rare, Shipman's willingness to visit his elderly, often housebound patients was seen as a mark of exceptional dedication. It was his unique selling point, and his deadliest tool. Beneath this veneer of professionalism, a disturbing pattern was beginning to emerge, a pattern visible only in retrospect. Like a ghost image in a photograph, the mortality rate among his patients was unusually high. This wasn't immediately obvious because his victims were almost exclusively elderly. When an 85-year-old woman dies peacefully in her sleep, no one asks questions. It's the natural order of things. Shipman understood this with a predator's instinct. He exploited the societal tendency to view the deaths of the old as unremarkable, expected events. He became a specialist in a very specific type of murder, one that mimicked natural causes so perfectly that it went entirely unnoticed. His method was chillingly simple and brutally effective. He would identify a target, usually an elderly female patient who lived alone. He would visit her at home, often under the pretense of a routine checkup or to administer a flu shot. During the visit, he would engage in the rituals of a caring doctor, perhaps taking her blood pressure, listening to her chest with his stethoscope. Then, at the opportune moment, when their tea was finished and the conversation lulled, he would load a syringe with a fatal dose of diamorphine, which he carried in his medical bag. He would inject his victim, usually in a muscle in their arm or buttock. Diamorphine, when injected intramuscularly, does not act instantly like in the movies. It brings on a gradual, quiet suppression of the central nervous system and, critically, the respiratory system. The victim would simply grow drowsy, feel a sense of warmth, drift off to sleep, and over the course of several minutes, stop breathing. It was a silent, peaceful death. There was no struggle, no sign of violence, no telltale marks beyond a time. After confirming the patient was dead, Shipman would begin the second equally important phase of his crime, the meticulous cover-up. He would sometimes stay in the house for a period, perhaps making a phone call or simply waiting, so he could be discovered by a neighbor or a visiting family member. He would then play the part of the concerned doctor who had just arrived to find the worst. More often, he would simply leave and wait for the body to be found later. The crucial step was the death certificate. As the attending physician, he had the authority to certify the cause of death. He would list a plausible, natural cause: myocardial infarction, cerebrovascular accident, or simply old age. He would then go back to his office and meticulously alter the patient's computerized medical records. He was an early adopter of computer systems, seeing their potential long before his colleagues. He would create a false medical history, inventing symptoms and conditions that the patient never had, all to posthumously build a clinical justification for the cause of death he had just invented: a complaint of chest pains a week earlier, a dizzy spell, a history of mini-strokes. With a few keystrokes, he could transform a healthy 78-year-old into a woman on the brink of death, making her sudden demise seem not just plausible, but inevitable. For years, this system worked flawlessly, but there were whispers. There were people who noticed things were not quite right. Alan Massey and his son, also named Alan, were local undertakers at the Frank Massey and Sons funeral home. They began to comment privately on the remarkably high number of deaths among Dr. Shipman's patients. They noticed his patients tended to die in clusters. They also noted something else. Many of his deceased patients were found fully clothed, sitting upright in their armchairs, as if they had died suddenly in the middle of their day. This was unusual. Most elderly people who die of natural causes pass away in bed during the night or early morning. But these were just murmurs, the professional gossip of people accustomed to death. Who were they to question the judgment of a respected doctor? Then, in March of 1998, a formal complaint was made. Dr. Linda Reynolds, a GP at the Brooks Surgery, just across the road from Shipman's practice, became deeply concerned. Part of her job was to countersign the B forms for cremations, the paperwork required to ensure no foul play was suspected before a body was destroyed. She noticed an alarming pattern with the forms coming from Dr. Shipman. The sheer number was one thing, but it was also the similarity of the cases. Elderly women, dying at home, suddenly and unexpectedly, all fully dressed and often found in their chairs. She felt in her gut that something was deeply wrong. She shared her concerns with John Pollard, the coroner for the South Manchester district. He, too, was troubled. He discreetly informed the Greater Manchester Police. This was the second major opportunity to stop him. A formal concern, raised by a fellow medical professional, passed on to the authorities. The police launched a covert investigation, but they made a series of critical errors that would cost at least 3 more women their lives. They assigned the inquiry to inexperienced junior officers. They checked Shipman's record and found the pethidine conviction from the 70s, but seemed to dismiss its relevance. Crucially, their investigation was superficial. They focused almost exclusively on the paperwork, the death certificates themselves. They saw that a respected local doctor had signed them, listing plausible natural causes. They did not perform any exhumations. They did not conduct wide-ranging interviews with the families of the deceased. They did not delve into the medical records with any forensic rigor. They essentially looked at the perfectly crafted fiction Shipman had created and accepted it as fact. In April of 1998, the police formally closed their investigation, concluding there was no case to answer. Harold Shipman had been investigated. He was now, in effect, bulletproof. He knew he had been under suspicion, yet he continued to kill, a testament to his staggering arrogance and compulsion. He believed he was untouchable, and in the 3 months that followed, he murdered Hilda Hibbert, Ann Jordan, and finally, Kathleen Grundy. In 1992, Shipman had left the Donnybrook practice to set up his own single-handed surgery at 21 Market Street. Here, he had total autonomy. There were no partners to look over his shoulder, no colleagues to question his methods. His practice was a success, and he was a respected figure in the community. He was the chairman of the local Tameside Medical Society. He was the doctor other doctors called for advice. He was hiding in the most visible place of all, at the very center of the local medical establishment. His control was absolute, and with this control, the rate of his killing seems to have accelerated. The victims were people like Irene Richardson, a 73-year-old woman in good health. Shipman visited her on a Monday. She was found dead in her chair by a neighbor later that day. Cause of death, Shipman certified, old age, or Lizzie Adams, 77. She was a spry, active woman. Shipman visited her to check her blood pressure. She died an hour after he left. Cause of death, he certified, heart disease. The stories are heartbreakingly, maddeningly similar. A beloved mother, a cherished grandmother, a friendly neighbor, healthy one day, dead the next, always shortly after a visit from Dr. Shipman. He was not just ending lives, he was erasing futures. He was stealing mothers from their children, companions from their spouses. He was a thief of time, operating under the cloak of care. He also often preyed on a particular kind of patient, those who, perhaps, reminded him of his mother, strong-willed matriarchal figures. The act of murder, for him, may have been a macabre reenactment of that formative experience, a way of recapturing that feeling of power and control over life and death that he had first witnessed as a teenager at his mother's bedside. He became so confident, so brazen, that he developed a particular habit. After administering the fatal injection, he would often make a phone call, using the victim's telephone. This small, seemingly insignificant act would later become a crucial piece of forensic evidence. By checking the phone records of his deceased patients, investigators could place him in their homes at the exact time of their death, a chilling digital footprint that contradicted his carefully constructed timelines. He also engaged in petty theft, taking small items of jewelry or sentimental value from his victims' homes after they died. It was a classic serial killer trope, the taking of trophies, a way of memorializing his conquests. But it was an act of pure, unadulterated greed that would ultimately be his undoing. His final victim was not just another name on his long list. She was the one who would, in death, finally expose him. Her name was Kathleen Grundy. Kathleen Grundy was a formidable woman. At 81 years old, she was vibrant, active, and wealthy. A former mayoress of Hyde, she was a pillar of the community, much like her doctor. She was in excellent health and full of life. On June 24, 1998, Harold Shipman paid her a visit at her home, ostensibly to take a routine blood sample for a medical study. Later that day, Mrs. Grundy was found dead on her sofa by friends who had come to give her a lift to the Age Concern Luncheon Club. Dr. Shipman was called. He arrived, confirmed her death, and told her friends and family that he had coincidentally visited her earlier that morning and found her on her last legs. A sad but not unexpected death for a woman of her age, he explained. He certified the cause of death as old age and took his leave. But Kathleen Grundy had a daughter, a solicitor named Angela Woodruff. Woodruff was devastated by her mother's sudden death, but she was also a sharp, pragmatic lawyer. When she was contacted by her mother's solicitor regarding the will, she received a staggering shock. A second will had seemingly materialized. A crudely typed, clumsily written document dated the day of her mother's death. This new will cut Angela Woodruff out completely and left Kathleen Grundy's entire estate, valued at nearly £400,000, to one man, Dr. Harold Frederick Shipman. The document was riddled with suspicious features. It was typed on a cheap typewriter. The signature, while a decent forgery, didn't look quite right to a daughter's eye, and the very idea that her mother would disinherit her only child and grandchildren in favor of her doctor was utterly preposterous. Angela Woodruff knew, with the certainty of a loving daughter and the instincts of a trained solicitor, that this will was a forgery. Her grief was now compounded by a chilling, sickening suspicion. She remembered her mother telling her that Dr. Shipman had recently been asking for details of her old will. Why would a doctor need to know that? She thought about the timing of the new will, supposedly signed on the very day her healthy, vibrant mother had suddenly dropped dead. The pieces began to click into place, forming a picture of unimaginable horror. This was not just a case of fraud. This had to be murder. Refusing to be silenced or intimidated, Angela Woodruff went to the police. This time, her complaint could not be ignored. She was not a colleague, raising a statistical anomaly. She was the daughter of a victim, holding a crudely forged will in her hand. This was concrete. This was tangible. This was motive. The police, perhaps chastened by their earlier failure to act on Dr. Reynolds's concerns, now launched a full-scale investigation, codenamed Operation Miasma. The first, most critical step was to find out how Kathleen Grundy had really died. They obtained a court order to exhume her body. On August 1, 1998, under the gray skies of Hyde, Kathleen Grundy was raised from her grave. Forensic pathologists took samples from her muscle tissue. The results of the toxicology report were unequivocal. Kathleen Grundy's body contained a massive, lethal concentration of diamorphine. There was no medical reason for it to be there. She had been a healthy woman. This was not a medical treatment. This was poison. On September 7, 1998, Dr. Harold Shipman was arrested on suspicion of murder. The man the community had trusted with their lives was now accused of taking them. The discovery of murder in the case of Kathleen Grundy was like pulling a single thread that caused an entire tapestry of horror to unravel. The police now faced a monumental task. They knew this was not a one-off crime of greed. They suspected that the rumors, the undertaker's whispers, and Dr. Reynolds's previously dismissed concerns were all horribly true. They suspected that they were dealing with something far more extensive, a killer who had been operating for years, perhaps decades. They had to go back, year by year, death by death, and re-examine every single patient who had died under the care of Dr. Harold Shipman. The investigative team was meticulous, and the scale of the operation was immense. They began by collecting all the death certificates Shipman had signed, then cross-referencing them with cremation records. Shipman had a strong preference for cremation, actively and persuasively encouraging families to choose it over burial. The reason was obvious. Cremation destroys all toxicological evidence. The police focused on cases where the patient had died at home, was elderly, and had been cremated. The list grew at an alarming rate, quickly reaching into the hundreds. They then began the painful process of contacting the families of the deceased. Over and over again, they heard the same chillingly familiar story. A mother or grandmother, in reasonably good health, who died suddenly and unexpectedly, usually in the afternoon, after a visit from Dr. Shipman. Many families mentioned that Shipman had been the last person to see their loved one alive. Many recalled him staying in the house for an unusually long time after the death, or his strange insistence that no autopsy was necessary. The most damning evidence, however, came from Shipman's own surgery. Detectives seized his computer. Shipman believed the computer gave him an unprecedented ability to manipulate his records, to create perfect fictions. But he failed to understand a fundamental truth about digital information. It leaves a trace. Forensic computer experts were able to analyze the hard drive of Shipman's machine. They discovered a hidden history, a ghost in the machine that told the true story. They could see not just the final medical records, but the history of the changes made to them. The audit trail was irrefutable. Time and time again, the records showed that Shipman had accessed a patient's file after their death, and retrospectively added symptoms and conditions. He was building a false medical narrative to support his false cause of death. He might enter a note about a patient complaining of chest pain, but the computer's internal clock showed the entry was made 2 hours after he had already pronounced her dead and signed the death certificate. This digital trail was the modern equivalent of a bloody fingerprint. It was the how of his cover-up, exposed in cold, hard data. While the investigation into the past deaths continued, the case against him for the murder of Kathleen Grundy was solidifying. A search of his house uncovered the crucial piece of physical evidence: a Brother electronic typewriter. Forensic analysis proved that this was the exact machine used to type the forged will. The ribbon still contained the faint impressions of the words he had written. And in his garage, police found a hoard of jewelry. Family after family came to the police station and, with tears in their eyes, identified rings, brooches, and necklaces that had belonged to their deceased mothers and grandmothers, items they had assumed had simply been lost in the aftermath of the death. These were his trophies. The police had now painted a picture of a killer who was not only prolific but also breathtakingly arrogant and greedy. The forgery of the Grundy will was an act of supreme hubris. After getting away with murder for over 2 decades, after being investigated and cleared by the police just months earlier, he believed he was invincible. He overreached. He got sloppy. In his desire for Kathleen Grundy's money, he left a trail of evidence, a suspicious document, a clear motive, a direct line of inquiry, that he had so carefully avoided for so many years. The investigation identified 15 specimen cases that would form the basis of the prosecution. These were cases where the evidence was strongest, often involving exhumations that confirmed death by diamorphine overdose, like that of Kathleen Grundy, or where the digital evidence of record tampering was particularly blatant and undeniable. The true number of his victims was suspected to be far higher, but the Crown Prosecution Service made a strategic decision. To prove 15 murders beyond a reasonable doubt would be enough to ensure Shipman would spend the rest of his life in prison. A trial involving hundreds of victims would be logistically impossible and risked overwhelming the jury with a sheer volume of information that could paradoxically weaken the case. The trial of Dr. Harold Shipman began on October 5, 1999, at Preston Crown Court. The public was transfixed. The idea of a doctor as a serial killer was a profound violation of the natural order of things, a story that felt more like Gothic horror than a contemporary news report. The courtroom was packed every day. Shipman himself appeared calm, confident, even defiant. He pleaded not guilty to all charges. He sat in the dock, listening intently to the evidence against him, occasionally whispering to his legal team, a picture of detached intellectual arrogance. He seemed to view the entire proceeding as an intellectual puzzle, a contest between his superior mind and the plodding efforts of the prosecution. The prosecution, led by Richard Enriquez QC, laid out its case with methodical, devastating precision. They presented the toxicological evidence from the exhumed bodies showing fatal levels of diamorphine. They demonstrated, through the computer audit trail, how Shipman had systematically falsified medical records to cover his tracks. They called family members to the stand who tearfully recounted the sudden and unexpected deaths of their loved ones. They presented the evidence of the forged will, the typewriter, and the stolen jewelry. The cumulative weight of the evidence was crushing. Shipman's defense was essentially to deny everything and attack the integrity of the investigation. He offered no coherent alternative explanation for the evidence. He claimed the patients had died of natural causes and that any irregularities in his record-keeping were simply mistakes made by a busy doctor. When confronted with the evidence of the forged will, he claimed that Kathleen Grundy must have typed it herself on an old typewriter she kept in her home. But police had found no such typewriter. His explanations grew increasingly implausible and desperate. He portrayed himself as the victim of a police conspiracy and a shoddy investigation. He took the stand in his own defense, a move that proved to be a catastrophic mistake for him, but a clarifying moment for everyone else. Under days of relentless cross-examination by Mr. Enriquez, his mask of professional calm slipped. His arrogance and contempt for the proceedings became palpable. He was evasive, condescending, and utterly unbelievable. He failed to show a shred of empathy or remorse, even as the jury saw not a dedicated doctor being wrongly accused, but a cold, calculating narcissist. On January 31, 2000, after 6 days of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict, guilty, on all 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. A quiet gasp went through the courtroom. Shipman himself showed no emotion. He simply stared forward. The judge, Justice Forbes, addressed him directly. "You have finally been brought to justice by the verdict of this jury," he said. "I have no doubt whatsoever that these are not the only killings you have committed. Each of your victims was your patient. You murdered each and every one of them by a calculated and cold-blooded perversion of your medical skills. You are a sinister and frightening man." He sentenced Shipman to 15 concurrent life sentences, with a whole life tariff, meaning he would never be released. He was also given 4 years for the forgery. Harold Shipman, the man who had held the power of life and death over a community for more than 2 decades, would die in prison. But the case was far from over. The conviction on 15 counts was just the tip of a terrifying iceberg. The true scale of his crimes, and the systemic failures that allowed them to happen, had yet to be fully uncovered. The conviction of Harold Shipman sent a shockwave through British society. It was a national trauma. The question on everyone's lips was not just, what did he do, but how on earth was he allowed to do it for so long? The government immediately launched a massive public inquiry, headed by a High Court judge, Dame Janet Smith. The Shipman Inquiry, as it became known, was one of the most extensive investigations in British legal history. Its mandate was twofold: to determine as accurately as possible the true number of Shipman's victims, and to identify the systemic failures that had allowed him to kill with impunity for over 2 decades. For 2 years, the inquiry meticulously examined thousands of medical records, death certificates, and witness testimonies. It was a forensic accounting of a lifetime of murder. The final report was a document of breathtaking horror. Dame Janet Smith concluded that there was sufficient evidence to prove that Harold Shipman had, in fact, killed at least 215 of his patients. She identified a further 45 cases where there was significant suspicion, bringing the potential total to 260. The vast majority of his victims, over 80%, were elderly women. The earliest confirmed murder took place in 1975, his last, just before his arrest in 1998. He had been killing on and off for his entire medical career. The inquiry's report was a searing indictment of the British medical system. It laid bare a series of catastrophic failures. The first, as identified earlier, was the General Medical Council's decision to allow him to continue practicing after his 1975 conviction for drug abuse and forgery. The warning signs of a doctor with a propensity for deception involving opiates were there from the very beginning, but they were not heeded. The second failure was the system of death certification. The inquiry found that the process was dangerously lax, a relic of a more trusting age. In most cases, the signature of a single doctor, the very doctor who might be responsible for the death, was all that was needed to certify a death and allow a body to be released for cremation or burial. There was no effective check, no second opinion required. Shipman exploited this loophole to its fullest extent. The third and perhaps most profound failure was cultural. The inquiry pointed to a bath of warm respect in which doctors operated. In the latter half of the 20th century, doctors were figures of immense, almost godlike authority. Their decisions were rarely questioned, especially by the families of elderly patients. When a doctor said an 80-year-old had died of a heart attack, the family accepted it. This culture of deference was Shipman's greatest weapon. He counted on it. He thrived on it. It provided the perfect camouflage for his activities. The inquiry also formally criticized the police for their bungled initial investigation in 1998, which, had it been conducted properly, would have saved the lives of his last 3 victims. In the wake of the inquiry, sweeping reforms were implemented. The death certification process was overhauled, with new checks and balances introduced. The regulation of general practitioners was tightened. Systems were put in place to monitor mortality rates among the patients of individual doctors. The case of Harold Shipman forced a fundamental re-evaluation of the relationship between doctors and patients, and between the medical profession and society at large. The age of unquestioning trust was over. Harold Shipman himself never offered an explanation for his crimes. He never admitted his guilt. He maintained his innocence to the very end. He refused to cooperate with the inquiry or speak to psychiatrists, viewing them with the same contempt he held for everyone else. The true motive behind his decades-long killing spree remains locked away in his own mind. Was it a twisted form of euthanasia? A macabre, obsessive reenactment of his mother's death? Was it a simple, chilling expression of power? A God complex manifested in the ultimate act of control over the most fundamental forces of life and death? We will never know for sure. On January 13, 2004, the day before his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman was found hanging in his cell at Wakefield Prison. He had used a set of bedsheets to fashion a noose. His suicide was his final act of control, denying the families of his victims the satisfaction of seeing him live out his days in captivity and ensuring his secrets died with him. The anatomy of this case is the anatomy of betrayed trust. It is a study in how the symbols of care, the doctor's bag, the syringe, the gentle bedside manner, the house call, can be perverted into instruments of evil. Shipman's evil was not theatrical or chaotic. It was quiet, methodical, and bureaucratic. He weaponized paperwork. He used clinical language as a cloak of invisibility. He preyed on the vulnerability that is an intrinsic part of the doctor-patient relationship, the moment when we, at our most frail, place our lives and the lives of those we love into another's hands. He didn't just murder 215 people. He poisoned one of the most sacred trusts in human society. The reforms his actions prompted have made the medical world safer, but the chilling knowledge of what he did lingers, a ghost in every consulting room. He proved that the most intimate of betrayals can come from the most trusted of hands. He did not break his oath, he inverted it, transforming the tools of healing into instruments of termination, and in doing so, proved that the most dangerous monster is the one you invite into your home to save you. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.